And we'll welcome our next speaker, Joaquin Navajas. Actually, there's a little bit of a mix-up on the lineup, Batja, Mesquita.
Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first time at COXI, and I find it to be a really interesting conference. I'm going to talk about emotional acculturation, by which I mean the changes, in emotions that occur as a consequence of contact with people from a different culture. And after hearing Yoshi Kashima's talk on the first day of this conference, I think I'm describing the meso level, mostly what happens between people in the domain of emotions, but also how it affects the micro level, how it affects people's psychology, and the macro level, how it affects changes in groups in society. Now, let me start with a concrete example that shows the importance of emotions. And this is an example that was inspired on our research in Belgian schools. Ayşe, a 14-year-old girl of Turkish origin, and Anne, her majority classmate, are reprimanded publicly by their teacher for talking and laughing with each other during class. And subsequently, the teacher asks them to leave the class. Now, Anne, the majority student, is very angry that the teacher treats them like 3-year-olds and makes such a big deal out of it. Ayşe, the Turkish Belgian student, sorry, I had to use this because my computer isn't working and I'm getting used to it. The clicker, it will go better. Ayşe, the Turkish Belgian minority students, feels the teacher puts them on the spot because everybody in the class can see it. But she also reports feeling ashamed because she should have paid the teacher more respect. And what you can see is that she's also reporting respect. Now, Ayşe and her Belgian classmate may find it hard to understand each other's feelings. And more importantly, I think, Ayşe may be less willing than Anne to confront the teacher and challenge her. And this, in turn, may create some distance between the girls. Now, this example is meant to illustrate several points about emotions. The first one is that emotions are about values and goals. Anne and Ayşe have different emotions because they have different values and goals. So in Anne's case, the goal is self-direction, you could call it. And in Ayşe's case, it's protecting the relationship with the teacher or honoring authority. The second point that I want to make with this example is that having similar emotions coordinates action. So the girls not having similar emotions actually would be inclined to do different things. And then the third point the example makes is that whether or not you have emotional fits may have a bearing on your relationship. Anne and Ayşe may find it difficult to understand each other because they have different emotions or they give different meanings to the situation. Now, for the purpose of this talk, it's important to realize that emotions are often about values or desired goals that are shared within a culture. And we have evidence for that, but I'm not going to show you that today. But it's important to know that the emotions that people in a culture have tend to be about the culturally central values. So in Anne's case, being self-directed or autonomous, in Ayşe's case, having respect for authority and protecting relationships. Now, the question that's central in this talk is, what happens when you move to a new culture or when you move between two cultures, as biculturals do? And about 15 years ago, my lab started to research emotional acculturation of immigrant minorities. Emotional acculturation goes beyond what you wear, eat, or celebrate, beyond minorities' willingness to adopt the majority culture, and beyond willful identification. Emotional acculturation is about having majority values and goals when you're in an emotional situation, or in Yoshikashima's terms, adopting the majority emotional norms. It is about sharing a social reality. And let me connect to another keynote by saying that emotions were conspicuously missing from Michael Tomasello's wonderful talk yesterday, and maybe that will change in the future. I'm going to show you some of the research on emotional acculturation. And in much of this research, we made use of a single method, which I will call the emotional patterns questionnaire. Now, keep in mind that what we would have liked to do is follow people in their life, in all the different areas of their lives, and see what kinds of emotions they would experience. But instead of that, or short of that, we developed this measure. So it was an important concern to us that the selection of situations was representative of the range of experiences in the different cultural groups. And we ended up measuring emotional experience for situations that were defined by their primary emotion. And primary emotion, according to the dimensions of valence, negative and positive, and another dimension of autonomy promoting versus relatedness promoting emotions. And it's important for this purpose to say that research shows that these dimensions actually describe the emotional domains in very different cultures. So situations were defined as being primarily in one of the four quadrants that's created by those two dimensions. In the anger quadrant are emotions like anger that are negative and autonomy promoting. Anger, for example, is an emotion that asserts my individuality, indicates that I'm entitled to more than I get, and it clearly marks the boundaries between you and me. In the shame quadrant, the relatedness promoting negative emotions, you can see that those emotions, especially shame, is about something that is wrong in the relationship. So in shame, you do something that potentially disrupts the relationship. And also you say that you're willing to do whatever it takes to reconnect with others. And I would say that holds for the other emotions in that quadrant too. And then on the positive sides, there are emotions like proud, strong, and euphoric that emphasize the individuality, and close, respectful, and helpful that emphasize the relatedness between people. So in the emotion patterns questionnaire, we asked respondents to report a situation that was defined by an emotion, either a negative or a positive emotions, and either an autonomy promoting or a relatedness promoting emotion. And we did so in the context of home in some cases, and of school or work in other cases. So this is an example of a prompt. Please think about a situation at your work or school. Sorry, the marking has shifted a little bit with the new computer, but in which you felt bad, and that could be good about yourself. And then we gave a lot of emotions as examples that were examples of, in this case, negative autonomy promoting emotions. And so respondents reported a situation that had happened in their past, and then we asked them to rate this situation on a list of 20 or 30 emotions. And what we got in this questionnaire is a pattern that it looks pretty similar as the one that I showed you in the beginning of the talk for Anne and Aisha, except for it had more different emotions. So here you see Aisha, and there you see Anne. And what we did here is we looked at how each individual's pattern of emotion related to the majority average pattern of emotion in that particular situation. So this was the emotional fit. We correlated, I mean, we did some fancy things with it, but we basically correlated each individual's pattern with the average pattern of the majority culture in the same situation. Now, what we also did is if we calculated the majority individuals fit, we left that majority out of the average. So we didn't inflate the majority's correlation or fit. Now, we conducted 3 studies using this emotional fit measure. The first study was a small-scale study with Korean adults in the US. Most of them were first generation. We matched them with a European American group. The second study was a study with Turkish adults in Belgium, slightly bigger. And here the comparison group were majority Belgians. And the third study was a very large representative study of minority youth in Belgium high schools. And this study was longitudinal. And at the end of the talk, I will show you some longitudinal data. What we find in these studies is pretty much similar. So we always find in each of those studies that the majority group has higher emotional fit with the majority average. And remember, this is leaving out the individual from the average than the first generation. We also find that each next generation has a little more fit than the previous. And we find that only in the third generation, immigrant minorities become indistinguishable from the majority. What I should say maybe is that the minority youth study included 100 different nationalities, and most of them were not close to Belgium. Now, this is an average. When you look at individual differences, then those individuals from minoritized groups who have been exposed to the majority group have a better fit. So if you look at the proportion of life spent in a new culture, you find an association. You also find an association, a negative. So the earlier you come to a culture, a new country, and including having been born there, the higher your emotional fit. And of course, the proportion of life and the age of immigration are not completely independent, but we don't find that there is a critical age. We actually find that if your proportion of lives goes up, your emotion becomes closer to the majority norm. And in the school study, we found that merely having majority students in your class actually predicts emotional fit. And we looked at proximal fit and distal fit. So distal fit, we looked at the average of all the majority students in the sample. The proximal fit, which you see here, was the majority students in the class. And you see that there is actually a pretty high prediction there. Now, interestingly, we do not find any relationship between traditional acculturation skills and emotional fit. So minorities' willingness to adopt the Belgian values, customs, and traditions is unrelated to how much emotions fit the average emotion norms in similar situations, the average majority norm in similar situations. I'm going to skip the two next slides to not be over time. But what we looked at is that whether you necessarily lose the fit with your heritage culture when you acquire the fit with the majority culture. And the answer is no, not necessarily. And there's even a little bit evidence for frame switching, but those are slides that I'm going through very quickly. Okay. So what I want to spend the rest of my time on is to show you how friendship plays a role in emotional acculturation. But first, I want to say something about the acculturation context that we're talking about. In Belgium and other Western European contexts, the large influx of immigrants is relatively recent, and there is no climate of cultural pluralism or diversity. In fact, large proportions of the population think that minority culture, and specifically the lower status Muslim culture, forms a threat to majority culture. This is the dominant view among adult majority members, but even in a high school sample in one of our own studies, we found that 48% of the high school students agree that the presence of immigrants forms a threat to their culture and traditions. Pretty scary, actually, but that was not a scientific remark. Now, we find that perceived threats of minority culture predict both the majority's preference that minorities adopt the majority culture, and also their resistance to heritage culture. So they don't want Turkish people, in this case, to maintain their culture, their Turkish culture. Now, against this background, and that may not be unimportant, we were interested in the association between emotional fit and friendships. And so for a subsample of the Belgian school study, we did a social network study. We looked at 152 networks. We had about half girls. The mean age was about 14 and a half. And we had a lot of majority and minority youth, again, mostly from very different cultures. And what we looked at for these classwork network is all kinds of connection. We looked at the extent to, so outcoming ties, this is in the language of networks. We looked at how often minority students nominated majority students as their best friends. We also looked at the opposite, how often they were nominated as the best friends by majority students. And we looked, and that's what I'm going to show you, we also looked at reciprocal ties. So we looked at the friendships that we considered the most real friendships, where the minority and the majority student nominate each other as their friends. And what we found is, and it's important that we controlled for social contact with the majority in general. So what we find here is the unique association between reciprocal friendships and emotional fit. And we do find that they're positively associated. So one way of looking at this is that emotional fit makes you more likely to form reciprocal friendships. But of course, could also be the other way around. It could be that friendships really help minority students to become part of the local majority culture. And in fact, if you look at it this way, we found that each reciprocal friend reduced the gap between minority and majority emotions by 18%. So that is really quite a bit. Now, finally, to see if the association between emotional fit and majority contact, what direction that association had, we looked at the longitudinal data of the same Belgian school study. And we looked at 3 consecutive waves. We looked in 70 high schools. Again, these numbers are all a little bit different. It's the same study, but of course, the data that we could use was slightly different for each kind of analysis. We did have some attrition across the 3 years, where the 3 waves were 1 year apart each. We had some attrition, but we didn't find differences in demographics between the students who remained and who did not. In this study, we actually tried to do this with network data. It turned out that the networks really change a lot in these years, and that's mostly because people changed, or the students changed schools a lot. So it was very hard to do this with the network data. We're still looking at other characteristics of the networks, but in the meantime, we looked at longitudinal processes with a measure of contact. There was a self-report measure of majority friends, and we asked them, how many of your friends have a Belgian background, so have a majority background, and how much time do you spend with Belgian friends during the break. And what I'm going to show you are multi-level cross-lag model. And we controlled for all the associations between within waves and also between waves for the same variable. This is a little slow. Okay, and controlling for all of these different things, what we found is that indeed fits did predict in two different waves. Fit in 1 year predicted friendship in the next year. And we also found the opposite. We found that if you have more majority friends, you have more fits in the next year. So you can say that, you know, again, in Yoshi's terms, you can say that in having these social networks, in having the friends, that you do learn as a minority student, the norms, the emotion norms of the majority. Now, just to summarize a few important findings. As minorities befriend majorities, their emotions shift towards the majority norm, and we call that emotional acculturation. Minorities' emotional fit itself, sorry, that is not what I wanted to say. Their emotion, I can't remember what is conducive to is conducive to friendships is what should have been here. So this is all the positive news, I think, if you look at the coherence and convergence of norms. There's also a downside of this. It takes minoritized individuals with an immigration background more than 1 generation to fit with the emotions of the majority culture, which means that there is quite a bit of diversity if you think that we have a lot of second and third generation students. And also that low emotional fit within the life of a person longitudinally predicts less inclusion, which we know from other research is really costly. Now, of course, there are several questions left, and we're working on those. So some future directions, actually current directions, I would say, is can we find the opposite? Do majority friends also, or do their emotions also converge with the emotion norms of their minority friends? It's a little harder to look at this because we have so many minorities, and so it's hard to, but we are looking at it actually with a more homogeneous group of Turkish and Moroccan students. We also want to know under what circumstances are there school diversity climates, for example, that make this more possible or more likely to happen? And a second question is, to what extent do new emotion norms emerge and under what circumstances? Can we negotiate emotion norms? Can we understand each other's emotions and to some extent adopt them? Okay, before stopping, I want to thank my wonderful collaborators, Alba Yassini and Josephine de Leersnijder from my own university, and Hee-Jung Kim from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And if you want to know more about this research and about a lot of other things that have to do with culture and emotion, my book just came out, and you can find information on my website, batjamesquita.com. Thank you.
So, do we have any questions in the room?
Thank you so much for that fabulous talk. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you think is going on in these friendships and the extent to which the friendships are really forming that bridge culturally. So, for example, you can imagine that the emotional profiles of those friends might be very close, right? And that's kind of the bridge to the broader kind of proximal group that you're measuring similarity to. And then, you know, what kinds of interactions or sharing of experiences is really necessary for this change to happen over
Yeah,
time?
that's a really good question. And I think a question that we mostly don't know the answer to. What we do know, we know that friendship predicts something. We know a few things. We know that friendship predicts emotional acculturation. Most of the research is, of course, not longitudinal, but we know that friendship predicts emotional fit over and above just social contact, which makes me think that something in the friendship is responsible for that. And one possibility is, of course, that friends disclose emotions with each other. We have also some evidence that what is important is how clear the emotion norms are. And so, for example, we find that if you look at both the density of the network and you look at how many connections there are between the friends of the network. So I would say how clear the majority norm really is, how tight that interaction is. We find also more emotional fit. And then of course those are little I would say pointers to what might be happening. We also know in research that Josephine de Leersnijder has done, we know that merely saying this is what majority people or students do or feel in this situation doesn't really get any uptake. So it's not only knowing how to do, but there is something in the disclosing between friends that makes it stronger than merely giving them the information. What I would think also is that, and this is not completely a good model for the relationship, but how do children learn from their parents? In part by constantly categorizing, making opportunities, exchanging about what this could be. So I think we don't have, except maybe for Yoshi's work and the work of Bernard Rimet about social sharing, we don't have a lot of, we have evidence that people, adults also share emotions, that they do that a lot. We don't really know what happens to the emotions very much when they share them, but that's, I think, the direction in which we would need to go. It's a whole range of questions that opens up with these first findings.
I'll ask you a question from the chat. This comes from Emira Pinarhus in Denmark, and they're asking if there are any cultural differences in emotional expression, and if so, what influences does this emotional expression difference have on the challenges minorities face?
I think there are differences in the emotions we feel and express. And I think the question comes from a theoretical background that I'm not sharing, which is that the emotions are really there and that the expressions are different. I think those often go together. But so I would think that that figuring out what people in other cultures feel from, of course, from their behavior in part. We don't walk around with self-report questionnaires. So in our actual everyday interactions, we infer from behaviors and from the situation and from interactions what people feel. And yes, I think that's hard. Well, what you see is that it's challenging. People do. The book I just wrote, I describe enormous differences between cultures. And of course, maybe I should have said that for this audience. Of course, that's the premise of this research, is that cultures, when you look between cultures, that they differ, and so that coming from that knowledge, that we were wondering what would happen when people don't stay in these cultures where they were brought up, but when they change cultures, or when I mean, I don't know, I don't mean by cultures that you necessarily cross the national boundaries. I mean, some people go from one culture to another several times in their everyday lives. So I hope I gave an answer to that question.
So we're very short on time, but if you can ask your question really quick.
Well, I guess maybe might not be so quick, so I might come talk to you afterwards, but I'm actually quite interested in the frame switching that you move past. Because in South Africa, we have multiple cultures that live very close to each other that are all South African, but vastly different, but then all acculturate to the Western English, thanks to colonization culture, and switch back and forth between all of them. And this is all new to me. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on the emotions of that briefly.
Yeah.
Otherwise I'll come chat.
Yeah, there is a little bit of research that suggests that people can do that. What I don't know, on average, people do that. So there is this daily diary study where East Asian Canadians actually have more, I should say. So the East Asian way of feeling emotions is that you can feel positive and negative emotions at the same time. And the Western way would be that if you have more positive emotions, you have less negative emotions. And so what you see is that as they travel through their day, that when they speak an Asian language or feel Asian, that they have more combination of negative and positive emotions. And when they speak English and don't feel and feel Western or Canadian, or I can't remember how they asked that they have more positive emotions at the exclusion of negative. We also find some in our own research. I won't go very long. So we think people can do it, and at least at the group level, people seem to do it. Now, if everybody does it, we don't know. There could well be individual differences, and from other acculturation literature, we know that frame switching is often dependent on how compatible the different cultures are, in the sense of, is one culture discriminated against? Are the cultures compatible in principle? So those kind of questions. So I don't have a concrete question to your answer to your question, but I think that we have reason to think that also in the domain of emotions, people do frame switch. We don't have very much knowledge yet about to what extent they do it, who are the people who do it, if it's done between all kinds of cultures, or if they're boundary conditions.
Thank you.
Thank you.